Three. Okay, we are on stage. Hello, hello. It's Tony again. I'm so happy to play with Tony.
How's it going, Dan?
Tony is a very disciplined, highly energetic guy, and he goes into action, man. He's making these obelisks and he's doing the cosmic work, teaching remote viewing. Tony is out there.
Thanks, man. And you know what? Some of the preposterous things that I have worked on are panning out. Things are starting to pan out. I built an obelisk and I'm getting some results. I'm getting measurable results. I'm getting magnetism and I'm getting piezo electrical results from the shape and the orientation of it. And I'm very pleased with it. And the lessons I've learned along the way are going to allow me to make a really powerful one
This
next.
is exactly where we're going today. So
Scaling up.
Tony figured out basically that the obelisk acts as kind of like ground zero for remote viewing. And then we began to ask why, and all the clues fell into place. So we've taken a slightly different view. So Tony's making and building these obelisks with ceramic and piezo, and we've developed this fire crystal, which is very analogous, very implosive, and also implodes and spits out the longitudinal EMF here. And Tony's the one who taught me about how you put that longitudinal into water and healed his girlfriend.
Yes, that was one of the first things, and having that having that effect, that result, led me to look at the ancient Egyptian obelisks. And when I began to really research them in my book, it drew the line. I'm just connecting dots. I'm not necessarily discovering anything. I'm rediscovering, and I'm also following in your footsteps on some of the things that you've designed. And after I got my head around the real gist of your science of how implosion works and how everything is related in that regard, it made it easy to understand how it works. So,
That's beautiful. So we want to go into some detail on that. So the topic of today's conversation is the serious science behind remote viewing, how it works, how that array works, how you embed and sample, embed in the hologram and look into the array like it's your own synapses, and how that works. And we're going to have Tony's slides of where he measured the distance between the obelisks and the water, because after Tony shot the crystal into the water, the longitudinal, and healed his girlfriend, he realized, hello.
so real quick, I'll tell that story. So my girlfriend Veronica and I were together, and she became very sick. She had an episode of great sickness. She had an inner infection, and she was in bad shape. She was in a bad way and did not want to go to the doctor till the last minute. And we did end up going to the doctor, but what I had done was used the Vogel technique, Vogel crystal, and charged. I was taking care of her. She came over, and it's like our second time ever being together. And I was taking care of her. I took her orange juice, coffee, and water in the morning, of a cup of coffee and a cup of orange juice. And she was in a bad way, 103 temperature. And I charged the water with the crystal. So what did you call it? Like, we are making the wave, the
That's right.
implosive wave being
If if
generated from the human mind.
if the breath has the discipline, we call it a phase conjugate pump wave, like the Mayer wave 10-second, which is the spine liquid pump breath, then that phase conjugate pump wave, which Vogel also used, charges the water because the low frequency coherent cascade, the spine liquid pump harmonics, implode the crystal and increase the output of that longitudinal coherence. That's the idea.
And it's a loving thought. So
Yeah,
you're conveying a loving thought, which is a blissful wave, which is conducive to the math of imploding at the golden mean.
that's right. And you genuinely cared about her, and that was in the wave, and that's beautiful.
Yes, I was
Perfect.
genuinely, my intentions were 100% loving in that pun. So I did that and put it into the water. You kind of push it with a snort, all your thoughts into one big snort po.
Yeah.
And put it in
Breath.
the water, handed it to her. She had no idea. Number one, she had no idea that I did that, or that it was could, or the technique. She had no idea of it. And she drank the she didn't touch the orange juice. She'd had some coffee. And when she drank the water a few seconds later, she said, "What's in that water?" And she drank more. And within a few minutes, she stood up. Her temperature went down into the 90s, and she was fine. She went, "Wow, I feel great." And I told her, and at that point, I told her and the effect lasted about 90 minutes. So
Mhm.
she had a bad infection. She had an infection, and um, so it lasted about 90 minutes before it resurfaced. And we didn't do it with the water again because I was dumbfounded. So I was playing with witchcraft at this point, and I didn't know what I
Yeah.
had just done. And I was really shocked at the effect, at the immediate effect that it had.
Yeah.
So
And so
that kind of
now,
led me into researching it, and I looked at the terminus and the quartz content of the obelisks, and that kind of sent me in that direction.
yeah. So it's like, so I got this phase conjugate pump wave. We believe the parallel sides allow the phase conjugation to be more accurate than Vogel's tapered side. But either way, and we use a piezo fire to zap a crystal, but then out the tip here, and you can feel that little cool breeze, negative ion wind, you're squirting a longitudinal compressional. And if that longitudinal compressional meets symmetry the other way, it has a net centripetal effect. And that's the neg entropy, that's the self-organization, that's the healing, that's the point. And now we want to extend that conversation to understand in far more detail the actual physics of remote viewing. That's where this conversation is supposed to go. I was watching Skip Atwater do his presentation about his work with McMoneagle yesterday, and these guys are amazing. They obviously are very good at it. It's wonderful. I'm sure you know these guys. And but it's for them, you can tell in the conversation, it's like a physicist talking about all kinds of good physics. And then when it comes to the subject of gravity, it to even imply that they could ask the question why objects fall to the ground, they're like deer in the headlights. Like, oh my God, are they avoiding that question like mad? Well, Skip Atwater and these guys, if the even the shades of the question of how does it work come up, it's like a hot potato. They get the hell out of there because
How does it work? Yeah.
how does it work? Literally, electrically, for electrical engineers. And if electrical engineers knew how to work, we can make a list of 10 factors that improve the remote viewing because we know the physics. That's
That's right. And so I teach remote viewing in my classes, in my groups. I have remote viewing groups. I'm up to 4 now. And I teach it from start to finish. Some people are experienced, and I have an advanced group that people can graduate to. I found that it's very empowering to actually complete something and graduate. So I have it in,
nice.
9 week increments. But one of the things I teach is the science of it based on what I've learned from you and elsewhere that I self learned,
Mhm,
and through trial and error.
mhm.
But my feeling is this, and I haven't watched that particular interview you're speaking of Skip Atwater, who was in the paperwork from the
It's new.
original
Yeah.
the original research in the 70s.
Yeah.
I
That's
think
right.
he's on the paperwork. But the thing I teach is the science of it, and my feeling is this: if you're going to play poker, you need to know every rule of the game. Otherwise, it will bite you. And so when you're talking about remote viewing or going into even a psychic state where some people are not remote viewing, they're doing clairvoyance or they're doing psychic medium work or whatever it is. But if you're going to use these things, you need to understand the rules of the game. There's a rule set of the science of it. So this is things we do. People have intuitive hits. It's the same exact thing as remote viewing all day long.
And
People
so
intuitively go, you know what? I think now's a great time to eat.
and they get the right
And it
intuition.
works out.
And so that's where we want to turn this from intuition to serious physics. Tony, maybe you want to turn off your shadow background because you do keep blinking in and out.
It's a blinky thing. It's this camera. Um,
Maybe we could look at your bookcase. It's okay.
okay, sorry. I warn you, it's a little messy back here.
It's okay, Tony. Don't worry about it. You're good. You're good.
Um,
So we did a little outline now. So the basic idea here, let me give you say you're going to say it and then you say it and say you said it. That's what. So what we're going to say is that the amount of compression at the longitudinal node is what allows you to get inside the hologram and embed in the array and see through the array like it's the synapses of your own brain, except it's a bigger array than the synapses of your head. It's the synapses of the planet. And the amount of compression allows you to embed in that wave node, and that becomes an eyeball. And we want to understand that with a great deal of physics here today. I mean, actually understand how this works. So, for example, we know that if you're at a magnetic line cross, or if you're at one of Tony's obelisks, you get more of the centripetal compression, making the longitudinal node compress more powerfully And that means that you embed in the array with more digital sampling, with more resolution. It's literally would be called electrically impedance matching. So you
I
literally,
describe it. I describe it as a shortcut.
there
So
you literally
the
got in.
array is to the Planck where you're accessing outside of time space where all the information is kept. And when you're in a nodal point, it's actually a shortcut. So
Yeah.
your consciousness and the waves that you're generating have a shorter distance to go to the Planck distance or to the array itself.
Nice, nice. And we agree that Planck distance is where the tuning happens, where the transverse EMF implodes at specifically Planck threshold called planckfire.com, enabling distribution into the longitudinal array. But I would take one issue actually gently, Tony, here. You see, that's another problem I had with poor Skip Atwater. He keeps saying, it's all timeless and time is illusion, time it doesn't exist, and space doesn't exist. And this actually is crap. If you want to be a scientist about it, saying time doesn't exist or you're timeless is pure
I,
crap. What
for,
actually, well, do you want to go
I was
first?
going to say for time not existing, my hair sure is getting gray and my back is sure getting sorer over the years. So
Yeah.
for time not existing, it's sure letting me know its existence.
So this
It's
is not
exerting its
helpful.
force on me.
To say time is not real is pure bullshit. No, the physics is time is a name for relative rate of spin only, nothing more, nothing less. And when you accelerate a donut, the spin rate at center speeds up, and that's called time. Einstein called that bending time in space, which is lousy language. No, when you said time speed up, the only thing you ever meant was spin rate speeds up. So when you're at a node of the array having bliss in sacred space, saying that you're timeless is pure bullshit. No, what you are is you are embedded in more superposed rotations at once. And the relative spin rate of those rotations happens to be golden ratio. Raymond Chow's measures of faster than light velocities, golden ratio times C. Hello. So you're not timeless. No, you have more spins superposed embedded in the array, and you can make more connections. It's very specific, and the word timelessness does not help. Anyway, my 2 cents.
We're talking about spin rate in one of the
Yes.
nodes.
Yes,
In node.
exactly. That you're actually able to connect with more spinning objects at once because you're locked into phase. And the best way to be locked into phase, obviously, is golden ratio, because that allows spins to be superposed non-destructively, which is the only doorway between dimensions, dimensions being merely a name for how many axes of spin of charge can be superposed.
So some people that go into remote viewing sessions and it takes a long time, or they go into a long time and then they turn around and go, wow, it only feels like a couple minutes. I've always blamed that on the individual, on the fact that you're lowering your thought
Yeah.
process and your heart rate and everything down, so into a meditative state. And so time, the perception of time can be altered. But you're
Yeah.
saying that
You're
the
connecting
array,
with you're connecting with more spins at once. A prime example of this is the classic just before you die, you see your whole life pass in about 1 second. Now, that is a compression of time. There's a very good physical requirement for that because in order to die successfully, you need to implode and compress in order to be propagated into the high pressure of that array of longitudinal nodes called the collective unconscious communion of saints, ancestor memory. So to get into that array successfully absolutely requires compression. And that's why you have that experience. You see your whole life just before you die. And we also have the slides of the Heinrich Clouvet form constants, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. The reason you see specific geometries just before you die is for that reason as well, implosive compression. So people say time speeds up, but actually you're coupling with more superposed spins at one moment. And so it's a compression effect.
and so there's actually more throughput in the same time.
Exactly.
Of information. Yeah.
It's discipline connection. And obviously, you can't superpose rotations well without using golden ratio. So doorway to the next dimension. So that's
Dan, I feel like we're speeding down the intellectual highway.
have I speeded up already? Darn. So
For you, it's morning for me. So I'm not used to having my background exposed in my office here.
And that's more than metaphor for background exposed.
So I was going to say another thing that the main purpose of the obelisk. So there is an effect when you're in range of it. It's a constant toroidal field. There's a magnetic and a piezo component to it. I tried to replicate the Aswan obelisks in the ones that I built. But what I've gone after is the harmonics through the obelisk. So the 783 harmonic specifically into a
Yes.
theta state is the one that really,
Perfect. That's the Schumann, and that's the phase conjugate pump wave. That's
well,
exactly
it's one of
what
the best ones
perfect.
because it ends on a zero. It's not a complex decimal behind it, so it's easier to tune into that one. And it happens to be the theta state for the human hertz, for the human brain.
Perfect.
So
Alpha. Yes.
that's the primo real estate on
How to
the
tune the amp. And so
scale.
this is going to give us an excuse to show Tony's slides of the obelisk in a minute. But so, there was a planned conversation. Believe it or not, there was a planned conversation. The planned conversation had two branches at this point. Tell me if this is okay. So the first branch was a short version of my history with Bob Monroe for a very particular reason. And the second branch is my history with John Dee, who was obviously doing remote viewing, even though he called it scrying. And that will lead us to the slides. But the reason I want to do the Bob Monroe shtick is because it leads us specifically to the frequency signature that triggered remote viewing for them. So anyway, my story there, and now, go ahead.
Real quick, let me guess. It's around the 783.
Well, actually, it started out at 7.29, exactly golden ratio times Planck. But then when we modulated that to the more accurate 7.83, the real Schumann, boy, did we get psychokinetic. In fact, we made the world's most powerful Bliss binaural beat. And that is the point of this part of the conversation. How do Bliss binaural beats drive your brain waves to implode, literally squirt you out of the top of your head, which is exactly my first story with Bob Monroe. So if I might tell my little fairy tale.
Please do. I'm interested. I'm gonna sit here and just take it in.
No, just to tell you, I'm not old or anything, but this story starts 40 years ago. We're in the 1980s, and Ed Wilson, MD, very famous guy at that point, is Bob Monroe's research director. And he phones me up from Monroe Institute and says, hey, I've been dumping these golden ratio heterodynes into binaural audio into the brains, and these people are imploding in their head and they're squirting them out the top of their head. Talk about a remote view. If you got a squirt gun out the top of your head, because it's a golden ratio phase conjugate pump wave, Tony's right, idealized the Schumann would be perfect. Anyway, so Ed Wilson says, and I know you're doing this work on the EKG, and he wants to come over and make a film about that with me. And I says, what about Bob Monroe? And he says, well, Bob Monroe is scared to death of golden ratio. That's right.
So, and can you just explain why that might be?
Well, yeah, because he's right. This could be, if you feed the seriously powerful Bliss binaural audio, remember the physics of binaural beat audio. You got the right hemisphere and left hemisphere heterodyning at implosive golden ratio, and the wave interference is not happening in the air, but only in the liquids inside your head. That implosion is now, and Ed Wilson said, it literally blasts you out through the top of your head. And you know, Bob Monroe at that point was basically saying, ooh, this could be dangerous. And actually, he was right. So 30 years later, I'm having this discussion with Laurie Monroe. But anyway, did you have a question?
Well, no, I was just going to say that the Monroe Institute also goes into some sensory deprivation techniques.
Yes,
And
which
that's one
helps
of the
you.
next areas after the obelisk is done, and I have a line of them. There's a sensory deprivation device that's going to go in tune with it that will also aid
Yes.
in getting squirted out your head.
Yeah. So we now understand why the golden ratio heterodyne is implosive. It's literally like a pine cone squirt gun, and it can squirt you out the top of your head. And it's just like Drunvalo said, don't do the last step with this, which is pent instead of hex. Instead, you're ready, which is the same as say, don't die until you're ready, because you need to be a shareable wave at that point, which means you need to know how to do compression, which just means you need pure intention, means anger doesn't compress the whole thing. It's literally the Templar near-death experience. Really, that's what it is. So if you ain't ready for the near-death experience, don't try imploding. But on the other hand, if you want to embed in the larger array, there's only one choice. The larger array has been collecting survival information in a holographic compression library for 1 billion years. And in order to get in and out of there, you got to do compression perfectly, which is called pure intention, which is measured electrically in a power spectrum of the EKG called heart coherence. I proved it. I measured it. I know exactly. You can measure pure intention. Absolutely. The heart becomes a laser when you think a terrible, shareable thought, and we know exactly why.
It's funny you're talking about intention because that is one of the core things that
Yeah.
we teach in the remote influencing.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so remote viewing is peeking at information far away or inaccessible information. Remote influencing is perturbing emotions or physical states or the outcome of certain things far away. And that relies solely on intention. It's built on intention. And so
Absolutely.
that seems to me that intention, there is a way that things, the buzzword that I hate that everybody uses is manifestation. There's a manifestation, what do you call it, technique to consciousness in the universe, the way the universe responds to consciousness and its intention. And this is you're coming back from the scientific version of
Exactly.
this,
That's right.
and I've come in from the meditative group
Yeah.
version of this,
But it's
and
right
others.
on. You actually gain electrical inertia when your heart knows that the collective grid array is actually embedded with you at the moment you feel for the survival of the whole, which is actually means you're actually in service, truly in the heart. And you've
I
gained electrical inertia because the thing that's cool is that's absolutely measurable. Take a power spectrum, an EKG, do a second order power spectra, onset of phase coherence, your heart became a laser, and it does that measurably when you tell the truth. So much so that you can use it as a functional lie detector. It's realheartcoherence.com. So
So I did a little bit of research, and when we teach remote viewing, I always tell people that you have to shut off your cognitive processes, establish a brainwave set or a state of mind in a meditative state. But the information comes here and then here. So the information you kind of feel it gather here. And I looked, you and I spoke last time, and you were talking about the heart versus the brain output, and the heart is 60 times more electrical output than the brain.
actually, the heart is typically about 2 to 5 millivolts, and the brain is 2 to 5 microvolts. It's more like 1,000 times. If you're,
Really? So
yeah,
the literature I found said 60 times, but
no.
that's probably
Depends where
right.
you. If you're measuring at the surface of the body, it's about 1,000 times.
So on that output, when you're talking about electrical charge, and then you tune to the right intention or mindset or whatever you want to call it, that electrical charge dissipating or collapsing down to the plank and accessing the information. It's just a huge. If we likened it to a telescope,
Yeah.
this telescope has a small aperture, and this one has a giant aperture
Oh,
to look
perfect.
through the membrane of time-space.
Wonderful, Tony. And we're just about to talk about apertures, so it's perfect. So yes, we know that the EKG drives the sacrocranial, the spine liquid pump, the physics of Kundalini, which delivers the bliss produced to the brain. And we've all heard that story before. But then Tony brings up the perfect question. What is the aperture? Now we're talking about this node, call it sacred space, call it a stone circle, or call it Tony's obelisk. We're talking about what is it about sitting at the PowerPoint and closing your eyes and seeing the big hologram. What enables you to see the big hologram if you're right at the node doing compression right? And that's the next part of our story. So just to conclude on Monroe Institute. So Lori Monroe and Chris Clean put all my friends at Monroe. Later, we showed them how to measure and teach golden ratio and brainwaves, but they were just like Bob Monroe. They were still afraid of it. But actually, it's the climax form of implosion and using your aura like a squirt gun. And it's true, it can be dangerous, but also it's the only way out.
And I'm skeptical about the danger of the consciousness because ultimately we're all the same
Well, it's
thing.
it's the same story as if you're visualizing the tetrahedral fire breath, Drunvalo's famous story. We taught this for years, and you're putting a tetracube around your body, which is absolutely the opposite of implosion. It's pure crystal hex stabilization. And then if you do the chin angle of the Sphinx and tilt 32 degrees, the cube here embeds and blinks 5 times and becomes this pent dodeca. And the whole thing goes from pent to hex. And suddenly, instead of being hex, it's pent, implosive, and golden ratio. And then, if you were ready, you became plasma projective and you can project into the dream. If you were not ready, you get dizzy. actually your aura destabilizes, which is to say, if you haven't discovered pure intention on the way in to that implosive compression, which is identical with why you need to prepare for death. And it's, as the Templars would tell you, if you do a near-death experience ahead of time, it's even better.
I'm
So,
glad I'm recording this.
so actually, this was called the lost art of resurrection, which is why you needed the 3-day near-death experience, because you implode into the array. And if you came back, and my father had this amazing near-death experience when he was a teenager, and he was an absolute saint. And I knew exactly why, actually. Yeah, this is just an example.
So you're talking about actually like a rehearsal,
Oh, yeah. No, in
a
fact,
mindset.
they think the Voynich manuscript was all these herbs to create near-death experience, and now they figured out why. This was the Templar vision. You needed to create a near-death experience. Freddie Silva, I think, got that part right in The Lost Resurrection. So by creating a quote-unquote synthetic or a planned near-death experience, that was the climax form of initiation for Templar, which is obviously Thoth.
So by doing that, when you actually do experience death, that there's kind of a roadmap for the emotions.
Well, in other words, you've done the implosive compression to see into the array. And so when you come back, if you survived, but when you come back, you have consumed perspective. My father had this perspective. He could always feel intuitively the big picture because he had been dead. Well, he was, massive auto accident. He was a teenager. He was out for 4 days, thought his brother was dead. But when he came back, the voice of God, the voice of presence, everybody loved him, that was his story. Anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So this is supposed to lead us to the next conversation, which is Tony's comment about aperture. And this is going to, so now we finished the little, okay, that's my short little Bob Monroe story. The next little story, which leads us to pictures, is the John Dee story. And the John Dee story is going to lead us to the pinhole mirror, the pinhole camera obscura, which is how Tony and I started this conversation. Actually, the way we started this conversation was when we realized that remember how all these artists in the Middle Ages, they figured out how they got these pictures so accurate. There was no cameras in those days. They had what they called the pinhole camera obscura. So if you had a really bright light and a small aperture in a darkened room, behind that aperture, you could project the inverse image of whatever was in the sunshine on the other side of the pinhole. It was literally a camera. Oh, Tony has a picture.
There's an old representation of camera obscura.
Wonderful. That's exactly where we're going with this. And so, yeah, go ahead, Tony.
I'm wondering, is it based on, does the thickness of the wall come into play, or were they using a thin membrane when they did this?
That I'm sure there's a thin membrane there because you can't use a thick wall. But the story we want to get to here is, why is it that the size of the hole is so critical? Remember, if you're designing a camera and you decide the size of the aperture, it's called depth of field. If you use a very narrow aperture, the depth of field is very shallow. That means the depth over which focus is possible. But if you have a wider aperture, then things are in focus over a greater distance from the lens, which is, they use this to teach the phenomenology of perception by Merleau-Ponty, by the way, because if your eyeball's narrow to a pinhole, it means the guy who's looking at you is collapsing your intention into something very narrow. It's called phenomenology of perception. But so I have other pictures of the pinhole camera, Tony, unless you do. But I just wanted to say one more thing before we do the pictures, and that is regarding John Dee. So remember, John Dee spent his life learning how to talk to angels and spirits. That's his whole life. Okay, which is basically making the kind of phone calls which remote viewers also need to make. So his whole life is studying that. So he discovered how you can telephone ancestors. That's his life. Ophanim Angels, plasma. Ancestor memory, plasma. He used something called an obsidian phase conjugate mirror, called a showstone, for ancestor phone calls, just like the Olmec, which what we're going to lead to now, the pictures are now, that Olmec black mirror, obsidian mirror, was quasi-phase conjugate, enabling the physics, and I do mean the physics of clairvoyance, which is why you use a certain kind of mirror for ancestor phone calls. Embedding into the array with the longitudinal interferometry coherent with the surface of the phase conjugate mirror, the Olmec black mirror, John Dee's famous scrying mirror. And that leads us to the physics of scrying. And remember that the turning point when Nostradamus saw the future was he discovered what coating, hint phase conjugator, to put underneath the water of his scrying cup, a black mirror. And then he looks in that and he weeps for those he sees in the future. And his compassion implodes the future to him. So the physics of Nostradamus was also the phase conjugate mirror for scrying, for ancestor memory, which is phone calls into the array by embedding into longitudinal coherence. So that sort of takes us to the pictures. Let me see if I finish what we're supposed to say about. Oh, and we're supposed to now define what we mean by event horizon. So now this brings us to pictures. Okay, let's see if I can do this now. Do this right. Are we ambitious? Telegram, Finder, Babel, Olmec, Electrum, application windows. Okay, you're now seeing my whole screen, I guess. I guess that sounds very good. Can we move this? Okay, you have my screen, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's exactly right. So we remember the context here is the film we just made, that how a charged vortex makes gravity. We had 28,000 views in less than a week. And basically it was to understand how this vortex, because it's golden ratio phase conjugate, implodes in the center and becomes centripetal. And this is the reason gravity is made by, for example, a Mercury vortex and all that stuff. And then the adding and multiplying is recursive at the center. And we mentioned about even Ken Wheeler's idea of these physics now is all golden ratio pence. And we mentioned the idea that Bill Tiller showed that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress, implode, measured 100 times. Now, for the first time, we know why focused attention causes charge to compress. So this brings us to the key picture. So like Tony's picture, so the point was, what we're going to try to explain with this conversation is why it is that the size of the pinhole determines if the image projects an invert view, literally turned it inside. See how it's turned inside out as it comes through there? This is called a Bucky bow tie. And this is drawing originally is from our partner, James Egan, who directs the Newport Tower Museum, who made this presentation for Fractal U. And in the Newport Tower, there is a pinhole camera. And what goes through the pinhole, he calls a Bucky bow tie, which is, and actually this is Alan Green. I'm sorry, this is James Egan, who also works with Alan Green, making a presentation about John Dee, why he put that pinhole camera into the famous Newport Tower, which proved, by the way, that he invented longitude and latitude. It's a whole wonderful story. And this is James Egan. So the physics we're trying to get out of this is right here, that when you make the pinhole too small, obviously you don't get enough light through. If you make the pinhole too big, the inverse projection goes away. You don't see the inverse image projected. But by the way, this is what's happening in your eyeball, quite literally. And the reason, and this is the point we're trying to make, the reason you need the pinhole to be the right size to project the inverse image here is because the vortex going through the pinhole has to implode, just like there, called phase conjugate. In fact, I've done 100 papers now on the phase conjugate cause of perception. So this pinhole now has everything to do with when you're sitting in that power point called the longitudinal node, Tony's obelisk. When you close your eyes, are you going to see the hologram or not? Which means, are you going to embed in the larger array because the frequencies implode and nest you in that array? So we want to think about the physics of the pinhole camera as we understand how you become the pinhole for the array, which is the longitudinal nodes of the consciousness of the Earth. You embed in the Earth, and eventually you can use that array to project yourself and remote view. So Did you have questions about that, Tony? Does that make sense, or what do you think?
Well, I have a few questions. I have a ton of questions. My concern is when it's a small pinhole and the light is imploding like that, does it limit the color bandwidth of the light? Like, are you
Yes.
seeing a shaded version on the other side? The color bandwidth, because the wavelengths of different colors obviously are bigger and smaller. So, does it limit your spectrum that you're seeing through that? And how small of a pinhole are we really talking about?
Yeah.
Is it
The
in
yeah,
nanometers?
no, the angstrom level of nanometers, which is the physics of color, is way much smaller than this pinhole. This pinhole is millimeters, basically, which
Right.
so then, but it's true still that the color depth is shallower, actually. And so if you had optics instead of just a pinhole, you could make a much better camera, which they learned in the following centuries. But the physics of why that image inverted the moment the camera started to work was when you got the pinhole to be the right size. So the vortex in the center of the Bucky bow tie right here could conjugate, implode, and sort. That is a communion point. And we want to make the point that we believe this is literally what's called event horizon. We'll,
So these happen anyway, with or without a pinhole.
well, actually, in ancient times, this was the only form of camera they had. Uh, so the pinhole was their introduction to the physics of perception. And we're saying the metaphor here is instructive to lucid dreaming.
So they discovered it, but what I'm saying is when you're looking at a regular object, if you're in your backyard and you look at something, there is a distance and an area that has this vortex.
That's right. In fact, the pinhole has to be the right diameter specifically so the optical pressure inside the pinhole allows the pine cones to kiss noses, which is exactly why you need to be in a place where the magnetic lines create enough compression. For example, the place where your brainwaves made golden ratio, or the place where the Earth grid made the golden ratio, where the magnetic compression lines, longitudinal, converged and made the compression, that's when you can implode and touch the array. For exactly the same reason that Korotkov and Kozyrev proved that you had to be at a longitudinal node if you wanted military quality telepathy. And we agree that that's also where you get military quality remote viewing. So, for example, these remote viewers out there who are sitting in metal rooms with electrosmog, they're committing crap to their profession. No, no, no. They
Yeah,
need
Dan, you're letting out secrets of remote viewing.
exactly.
So very often, people in my groups, they will have scores. So we have a scoring system and we have results, and they go, "Man, I'm just not getting the data. I
Yeah.
did remote view last week, and the last couple of weeks I'm not getting it." And they move. That's my very first recommendation. There's a host of things you can tweak, but my very first thing is move out of the room, move to a different spot.
Well,
And
move
most of
to
the
where the
time,
yeah, sorry.
there's a huge improvement in data.
Yeah, exactly. Move to where the goddamn, I mean, where the bad Wi-Fi and Bluetooth is shut the hell off, and also move to where the magnetic line cross. Also move to sunrise and sunset. Also move to equinox. Move to where the magnetic lines implode. It's very simple. In fact, learn what sacred space is for electrical engineers, and then you'll have a clue how to line up the remote view.
And you know what's funny is, and so the other thing, I work my way up to getting outside to a nodal point, to
Uh,
working to finding nodal points. But what is true is that once you're aware of them and you go out into nature, they're everywhere and they're
exactly.
obvious. You look and they're everywhere. It's tougher in an area that's a flat.
Yeah.
If you're in a state, one of the plain states, or somewhere that's very flat, it's tougher to see them, but they're still there.
Yeah.
But in a mountainous region or in a hilly, rolling hill region, you can really see these nodal points.
Yeah.
Nature
So
is designed around them.
exactly. And so basic dowsing skills are essential because then you'll know where the magnetic lines cross, where the compression is possible, and where is the eyeball. That's the point. And so we're continuing now. All of this implies we're saying, yes, this is the physics hygiene for remote viewing, but it's more than that. We're introducing stargates and telepathy and all the cool stuff here.
Well,
So
remote viewing is the gateway drug to all psychic ability. So that's the way I look at it. So it's a gateway because it's instantly confirmable. But
I love
psychic ability, it's all the same. It's all the
yeah.
same, you know what I mean, temperature
That's
that
right.
you're
So
experiencing.
later, Stargate and Portal and telepathy and bilocation. Once you understand longitudinal array, you can begin to think accurately. So this is good. So now the next little part of this lesson, this should be a little better now. I have just the keynote, not whole screen here. So is to understand why the Olmec walked like 60 miles to get the right stone, a kind of blue stone, which is high dielectric, into which their ancestors could inhabit the stone, the Olmec sacred stone heads. And the same Olmec here used the famous obsidian mirror. And what the obsidian mirror was, very similar to the show stone, the scrying stone that John Dee used. It was Aztec originally for his famous phone called the Ophanim Enochian Angels. We have that whole story at goldenmean.info/Ophanim. The point here is to understand the physics of why did this particular kind of mirror enable phone calls to ancestors and angels. That's the physics. And the surface of this mirror, not unlike the surface
And
under
I'm
Nostradamus.
curious too, if the effect happens only on the initial plane of the mirror, or is it a deeper, does it penetrate, and is the effect happening in a deeper set of molecules? It's right on the shine of it.
Actually, no, it's the opposite of right on the shine. In fact, one of the famous stories of the beginning of scrying is to learn what they call diffuse focus. So if a clairvoyant is telling you how to look at someone to see their aura, the first thing they will tell you is diffuse your focus. So instead of just seeing the surface, you're like looking through them. And that's called depth of field, which is exactly the metaphor here, because you're needing to sample a larger depth of phase relationships in the array, which gives you longitudinal proprioception, which is the physics of clairvoyance, of course. So here, for example, if this were a quartz sphere being used for scrying as well, basically you're needing to phase couple with the nodes of a longitudinal array to see auras, to see ancestors. Just like the kids who are taught golden ratio in their brainwaves and they start seeing without their eyes, at the same time they begin seeing their dead grandmothers. It happens all the time. So basically they're learning to phase conjugate and embed into the array. And that's the point. That's the kind of physics of this slide.
So some of the stuff is happening deeper physically in the mirror.
Well, in terms of your perception, you think it's happening deeper in the mirror, but actually it's setting a condition where the hologram around the mirror is allowing the hologram inside your head to enter a longer wave of phase discipline and therefore prehend more components of the longitudinal array, literally increasing the sampling window, embedding you more deeply into the array. It's literally.
And really, we're talking about mental focus here. So you really ultimately don't even have to be looking at it.
Yeah, it's a depth of field kind of thing. So you're totally relaxed and you're seeing through the person, and suddenly you see the aura around them, the beginning of clairvoyance. Well, the similar is true to how to learn to use a phase conjugate mirror or a scrying stone or to see ancestors. So the point is the ancestors and the angels and the Ophanim, all these stories, they exist as plasma domains into a larger longitudinal array. And to embed in that array is everything we're talking about today, including the dolmen and the obelisks. So now the next slide here is from our series on Shakespeare. Now remember, John Dee John Dee didn't write Shakespeare, although some people think so. But when John Dee taught Shakespeare how to unpack a tetracube and lay it out into a cube octa, later called the Globe Theater. So the Globe Theater was an unpacked tetracube into a cube octa. And the reason everything about Shakespeare is always named Alchemy is as follows. So if you're in that Globe Theater and you present on that stage a sequence of emotions, on one side is anger, on the other side is fear, on the next side is joy, and the next side is awe. And you present a sequence of emotions inhabiting a sequence of players. At the climax of the play is the thing in which we'll capture the conscience of. There's a moment called consumed perspective at the end of the play in which you suddenly realize you now feel for everyone that was in the play like you have embedded in their aura. And the way you did that was you phase conjugated opposing exact opposite emotions into a timed set of symmetry sequences to phase conjugate and implode emotions creating the alchemy of consumed perspective by presenting the emotions in the exact symmetry sequence of the way phase conjugate lasers work, which is a cube octa right here in the
So,
Shakespeare theater.
what was the result of that for the people that were in the play? If you're embedding into them emotionally, like what was the result they were after?
Well, the result thereafter is at the end of as the play's beginning, you're kind of thinking, oh, that's a bad guy. That's a good guy. That's a bad guy. That's a good guy. But by the end of the play, you realize you feel for all of them equally. And you realize, oh, they are another you. And that's an implosive, consumed perspective moment, just like when you realize that because the discipline of the symmetry of the eyeballs on the peacock's feathers, or the discipline of the symmetry of the facets of the insect eye, you have the possibility of consumed perspective precisely because of the discipline of fusion of the phase lock of the array.
Okay, so let's hold on because there's a lot of big verbiage there that I think a lot of people won't follow. But that experience is that so they're presenting data,
Sequence of emotions in opposite
one
emotions,
emotion at a time.
opposite sides, opposite emotions, opposite people in symmetry, sequence, and imploding, phase conjugating. And suddenly you realize, oh, these opposite emotions were actually all you. Consumed
Interesting.
perspective. So you implode and suddenly you realize you are everyone in the play. Oh, that's called alchemy, which is the name of everything Shakespeare ever did.
Well, you know what else I would compare that to? Having experienced it is a near-death experience.
There you go.
So that's the
Exactly.
result of something when when you come back to life or when you're in a very desperate situation, you realize that everything could be you. It could always be you, no matter how well, I don't want to get into a ton of philosophy and like things that I've experienced, but ultimately that is the experience. And I think people that don't share that perspective
Yeah.
have maintained their personal perspective their whole life. They haven't really had to entertain other perspectives.
And really feel for. And the beginning of feeling for is like Nostradamus was weeping for those whom he saw in pain in the future. And that's how he sucked the future into his body. That's called empathy. That's why the Time Lord at Montauk was called the Time Empath. To steer the suction of the vortex into yourself, it is the implosive physics of empathy. Absolutely. And so,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to carry us off subject, but there's a ton of stuff I would mention that is relevant to that. And we see empathy being something that seems to be purposely stamped out in many
Unfortunately, there goes soullessness as well.
yeah, and the ultimate the other thing that's recently in what I've been working on and just the research, so researching the elements that I would be using for the obelisk to construct the obelisk and thinking about the math of how big everything is and how everything works is the field at the bottom of it all, down towards the Planck and where the protons are. You can call it ether or unified field or whatever. Um, but we're all made of the same exact stuff anyway. So empathy is a natural state. It's the state of the universe. If you're unempathetic, it actually is an anomaly.
Yeah, that's right. But it's soullessness. But unfortunately, the more we fractionate the grid, the more soullessness and loss of empathy happens. So here's Tony discovering the physics of the grid when he discovered, Tony, the distance between the obelisk and the water is because, go ahead, Tony.
The wavelength.
Yeah,
So they have a wave and then they have an array that directionalizes
I
it.
love it.
So they start out with a toroidal and a planar wave, and they put it into an array.
I
So the
love it.
Bobolik or Florence, Italy, and the Bobolik, you don't see it so great in this picture, but towards the middle where the obelisk is, I guess there's a black line to it right there above the picture of the obelisk. Right next to it is the Pitti. It's called the Pitti Palace. The Pitti Palace is a joke, but it's Pitti. That's how it's pronounced. But it
Uh,
has the same column array as the Karnak Temple. If you go to Karnak,
huh. I don't think I have the third slide here, unfortunately. Do I? No.
there's
Oh,
Luxor, that one right there. So the Vatican one you don't have. But if you look, the obelisk, they had several obelisks because there's a squirting effect between when there's two toroids next to each other where they meet in the middle, there's kind of a perturbation. It's not a perfect circle that kind of squirts it down the middle. And then they have that array, and it's all of high, with quartz content.
I,
So, and the same distance, because that's the distance of the wave repetition, the wavelength of
exactly.
a low hertz, and it's mentally induced. So I'm theorizing that there's a team of priests that put an intention behind over at the arch at the other end of it, and their wavelength hits this array
Yes.
and is converted to raw piezo that
Yep.
is conductive and finds its way to the water. And the in the same way that I did the crystal for Veronica, which made her feel better. It's the same exact
Yep.
technology, the same phenomenon, whatever you
The
want to call
water's
it.
charged. The water becomes
And
more
this is a
fertile.
machine.
Yep.
These are machines.
Exactly. This is
The
what.
bottom one is the Vatican. I think the Vatican is the jazziest of them all. It's in the chat if you look over to the right.
Oh, I didn't get that. I didn't get that in here. I'm sorry. I didn't.
So, and then the Vatican obelisk and the Boboli obelisk were commissioned within 20 years of each other from the same people, basically.
Yeah.
Florence, Italy, the Boboli Gardens. So this obelisk that's the same wavelength from the river there is known for its famous water quality and its fine wine that it produces. And a lot of people are familiar with Vogel's experiment of running water and creating award-winning wines by using a crystal. So this is the same effect on a macro scale. This is an industrial scale. The PT Palace is the same array as the Karnak array. And if you can't get the Vatican, I have it on my end.
Yeah, if you want. I was just going to say, I just had a major rush, Tony, that when Gus Ciccacci introduced me to Bucky Fuller, he took me to our conference at the Pitti Palace in Florence, Italy, where I had my first
We've
major
been there.
initiatory experience, and that's 50 years ago. But did you want to show the picture we missed here?
Yeah, let me do a quick. Well, so I also want to show if I can get into the book parts.
Or I could do
Here's
this.
the Vatican. It's the same thing. Over here is the Basilica. It's aimed, and then if you look here, can you see it good?
Yes, yes, we got it. We got it. It's working.
So
Yeah.
the other thing is the shape of the piezo is planar.
Yeah.
So when you talk about a cubical shape, the
Mhm.
obelisk is setting on a cube, basically.
Mhm.
And its weight is compressing the quartz content and creating electrical output. But they've also marked off the weak areas. Out of the corners is the least amount of input. I've modeled it. I used AI and modeled the wave shape.
Yeah.
And these are the strong waves going this way, and they have water intake. There are water fountains here. And this wave. So it would literally make the cross
Yeah.
of
And
a piezo beam, and they
that
have it marked where you would stand where you're not affected by it.
that longitudinal wave then comes off and heals the water
Well,
and
it embeds the water, so you
it,
can put an intention into the water, and so your intakes, your chemical intakes, so you could put something like aspirin in this water and push it
zap it
through,
and zap
push
it.
it through, and then this water would take on the
Yep.
electrical properties of the aspirin, not the chemical, but the electrical properties of the water, and
We've
everybody
actually
that drank it would have the effect of aspirin
We've
slightly.
actually we've actually administered vitamin C using exactly that physics. But I wanted to make one more little point, Tony. Your idea that the weight is sitting on the pad underneath, which is piezo. Now, if you realize that weight is being vibrated with the Schumann harmonics, why the pyramids are called the Hummer. So the weight is modulated with the Schumann harmonics, modulating the gravity wave, which is precisely the phase conjugate pump wave driving the piezo underneath, which is why we use piezofire.com under our fire crystals. So you see how Tony has put the pieces together here so much. I just love it.
Well, and then so I've also had great results. I'm sorry, I'm having a software issue here. There it goes. I'm also having great results with what I've built, and I've only built a crude version.
Oh,
So I
yeah.
have already designs for one that's got a focus. I'm putting barriers around it that are non-piezo conductive. I'm putting other things involved with it, and I've been running through the harmonics off your cascade based on your math of
Mhm.
your harmonic cascade coming 783. 7.83 is
Is
the
bingo, bingo. Yep.
center of the universe for me on this work that I'm doing. I wanted
Exactly.
to show a few other things that are curious out of this while we're on the subject of the distance of the wavelength.
I just wanted to say that while you're doing, we discovered, actually, it's Patrick, after zapping the crystal with the right ultraviolet is off the charts for bioactivity and zapping. But that's another
Okay,
story.
so that's going to come into the sensory deprivation. So the ultraviolet and
Yeah.
the near infrared actually matters in the process. It seems to be a process,
Mhm.
and that's going to be involved with lasers and diffusers in a face mask or a glasses. But that's on the drawing board. I don't have anything operational right now. So
Phase
that's
conjugate pump
that's the
wave from
next
the laser.
phase of this.
Nice.
And the Monroe Institute was aware of this, and so is the U.S. Army.
Yeah,
So
probably.
these are military thing. I just want to show these other slides while we're on the subject of distance. So this is the capital city of Kazakhstan, Astana, and they have towers arranged at the same wavelength. They have an array. This river, actually, the Ishim River, is a creek. It's a small river, but they've dammed it up so they've got more surface area that they can create the effect.
Ah, yes.
So this seems to be an array of the same exact effect.
It's always 0.72 miles. How interesting.
And there's always a quartz component and a water component on both ends. So
Nice.
this Hamdel, New Jersey, the Bell Labs grounds in Hamdel, New Jersey, it got my attention because the same architect designed the arch in St. Louis.
Aha.
And if it comes
Yes.
through, so the arch actually has a pyramid on the other side at 7.72 miles from the river. So the Malcolm Park Memorial, this pond was made after the fact at the same distance
Aha.
too. But on the other side, I thought I had a slide over here that showed it better. I don't.
Reflecting in Project Star.
I don't. This is Washington, D.C. The reflecting
Nice.
pool catch the entire thing. Although, from everything I know, the Washington Monument is incorrect. I don't think it works well.
And when they learn how to measure the longitudinal nodes, they can quantify this beautifully. Spectrum analyze a low frequency weak capacitance, find out if it's implosive. This is all very measurable once you understand the physics of how the array is being charged.
Yes. And so here's a good one in the Paris one. You can see the base would bear the load and
Yes.
has a lot of PZO. So I think that on top of the because they're not a 60-degree cone either.
Mhm.
Most of them are 70 degrees. And the reason for that is because it perturbs the bands of the magnetic torus. So what they're doing is adjusting the magnetic toroidal, the bands at the top, they're adjusting the distance of the torus. That's what I'm feeling. Why the pyramidal shape at the top is not a 60-degree cone, because they're not worried about the effect at the top of the cone. They're worried about the carrier and the effect of the piezo wave coming out of they're aiming it out of the block that it sits on.
If the block is piezo and the heavy structure is vibrating at Schumann cascade, which is a phase conjugate pump wave, that pumps out longitudinal out of the piezo block. And by the way, it's
Yes.
close to the 72 degree of the pent implosive anyway. So
And so the granddaddy of them all is the Karnak temple, because they had two obelisks side by side going into the array. And then they had the row of sphinxes or lions, and then they brought the water right up to it back in ancient times. So
yeah.
they literally had a quartz component going all the way to the water. So they wired it better. It was a
Mhm.
better wiring, and it didn't matter really the size of the wave, wherever it caught, because I'm sure depending on the source of the wave, where the priests were standing when they were embedding, the
Yes.
wave would land. So what they did was they made an array that caught the wave. So it was very efficient. What we're seeing in the Karnak layout is extremely efficient, but they were right next door to the granite quarry that had the correct amount of quartz and ferrite. So a magnetic and a piezo thing in the same
Exactly.
device,
Beautiful,
in the
beautiful.
same carrier.
And when that coherent longitudinal hits that water so massively, you have a solubility effect, you have a fertility effect, you have a healing effect, you have a centripetal effect, you have a surface tension effect. All this is measurable. This is
Oh, the 50, is it 53 hertz, the harmonic where you're for healing, for you
that's
saying
right.
that
Well, see,
route to neg entropy
the
works.
actually, what the physics is that Planck predicts it should be 50 hertz. But since if you take the difference between the theoretical 7.29 to the actual Earth 7.83, and you do golden ratio from there, you land at 53 and not 50. And every single pyramid we ever measured, hello, producing rejuvenation, big 53 hertz component. Absolutely.
Very close to the angle of quartz, natural quartz as well. The Eiffel Tower. So interestingly, I can't find the literature, but my mother read a book and really talked to me at length about it when I was young.
Oh,
That when they designed the Eiffel Tower, it was designed to do many things, radio signals. They were doing experiments off it, but one of the things that nobody understood was that he said it was going to improve the water quality of the river. And
yeah.
it was a
Well,
big promise that Eiffel did for the financing, and it didn't work because it's not made out of a piezo conductive material. It's
well,
made out of raw iron.
I had this discussion with Cedric Manu, who wrote the book attempting to prove that Eiffel was in fact the alchemist Fulcanelli. And
Really?
I said to Cedric, I said, well, he made the damn thing out of steel. And he said, no, he made it out of
Raw,
iron
raw iron.
because
Yes.
it could be paramagnetic. And if you focus that, you can get a longitudinal component in theory. But
So
you would,
that's what he did, but he didn't have a high piezo
that's right.
content.
So we
He
could
didn't
fix
have a
it.
prod. So he
Dear
could fix
France,
it. It failed. Yeah.
Dear France, if you would like your Eiffel Tower to actually heal people, you would need some piezo. Oh yeah,
All you got to do is coat it with some barium titanate, and it would work. It would sing like a champ.
and Valerie kindly helped dig out. So here's the book by Cedric Manu on George Eiffel being Fulcanelli, being actually the climax of the study of alchemy, even in the Gothic cathedrals. It's an amazing story. So Eiffel's highly esoteric here.
That's amazing. I remember. It's weird that I have a gift of remembering really insignificant, irrelevant data from a long time ago. And I always remembered my mom telling me that story. It was in the newspapers. And when you go back and look for it, none of it's available.
Yeah,
And you
that's
go
right.
back and look for what he was doing. But he was promising to purify the water in
That's right.
France because this seems like they've always had a problem with the sign being polluted
That's
or
right. So what you need, obviously, your magnetic map needs to look like a rose, and then it will phase conjugate, and that will purify the water. It's very simple, actually, which, the magnetic map of Prague is a rose, and I was able to talk to Valerie's ancestors there, actually.
So I want to show, and then the other thing is that in terms of when I'm going through these slides to different places, Homdale, New Jersey, that all have the same array shape. This is global. These are not all of them. I find them Shanghai. It's all over the world. There is a group of people that understand this technology that
Mhm.
has the ability to fund these projects, and they have been with us for quite some time because the Karnak Temple is like 1800 BC or 1400 BC when they started to commission these obelisks being made. There's
Yes,
the Hippodrome. Um, I don't know
yes.
where
And
other.
actually,
Oops. Oh,
oh,
yeah,
that's a handsome dude there.
that was my author picture for Beyond Sight. So where all this information in the chapter that I draw the line to it for the water and from other studies of the Vogel crystal and the effect that we're talking about imbuing the water is in my chapter 3 of my book Beyond Sight. So,
Beautiful.
but you can go everywhere and start looking at ancient sites. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to Google Earth. I've always looked for my own reasons and but these are all over the place, man. And
So then,
this is the granddaddy of the most operational one. The other thing is we're seeing an array of the toroidal field here. And
yes.
so I'm going to build a small version of this in my yard and see what happens. I started with the obelisk so that I could imbue water, but
You
it's
you
turned
could
into something completely different because of your work.
that beautiful, and that would make you a Templar, which is a point I wanted to make. So I don't know if we're
Not
going
officially.
to. No, actually, officially, that's where we want to go. So the end of the slideshow that I started here is actually the grid maps of the Templars, which are an extension of exactly what Tony just described, which was called the Templar Agenda, the Repair of the Fabric of Time. And I have the William Bueller Templar pictures about that in the slideshow, but I don't know if we're going to get that far. But
Have a peek. Let's have a look.
oh, well, actually, there. Templar pictures down here. Um, so it's all at goldenmean.info/Bueller, Buehler, Templar Agenda, the Repair of the Fabric of Time. And basically, it's all these star maps on the Earth where the Templars use these grid maps to empower their cathedral lines. I'm sorry, I got too much stuff in here just to, uh, well, but just to try to take the little, wait, here we go. Look, found them. Okay, this was called the Rochelle grid of the Templars. The Templars are building these star maps. This is from William Bueller. And then overlaid these in detail on Europe. And the Templars were very clear. Their teacher was Thoth. In fact, William Bueller, my teacher from the Templars, was making phone calls to Thoth just about every day. And you can find these in goldenmean.info/Bueller, Buehler, the Templar agenda, the repair the fabric of time. And what they obviously meant was the spin implosion. So they have these maps they call Rochelle grid, and they're all over the Earth grid because this is how they're doing the agenda, the repair of the fabric of time, which is an extension of exactly what Tony was just speaking about, actually. So yes, I call you a Templar, absolutely.
Oh, wow. So that picture of the globe, could you go back to that one?
Am I?
Oh, it had the globe in it. It was the one you had just before this one. There it is, that one. Look at that. So those are pence.
Yes, absolutely. Well, this
Pence
is
facets of a dodeca.
that's right. This is anti-gravity in the world grid and the Becker-Hagens, and you can actually buy the Google Maps superposed algorithm to lay this
So
out.
this, so these nodal points on this larger grid of when we're talking about the Earth dodeca nodal points, they're fluid. They're not stationary.
That's right.
They move.
No, and in fact, they're not arbitrary geometric. These are actually measurable longitudinal nodes. And until you learn how to measure them, you're still a woo-woo, in my opinion. This is all about the Rennes-le-Chateau story here, the Holy Grail story, and the bottom is the story of Washington, D.C., basically, which is all about this phase conjugate repair of the fabric of time. So yes, that's why I call you a Templar, absolutely. There's a few more slides. Let's just see if we get through a few more. But sure. If you look, this is the twinkle in the eye. So this is someone at a rave party having bliss, and they got this orb in their eye. And if you zoom in on the orb, do you see a dodeca? So this is
yes, there it is.
This is like when you asked your father, well, what happened before I was born? And your father says, well, you were a twinkle in my eye. Well,
it was a twinkle in the eye because you literally were in the array.
That's right. That's right. And there was bliss at this party, and there's some challenges about astral hygiene. And so here is this phase conjugate. In this case, we talked many times about Jean-Charles brainwaves, off the charts coherent, alpha, beta, cascade, golden ratio, octave. And then he would teleport repeatedly with witnesses, came back with sand between his toes. The physics of how that worked was this massive EEG coherence at the same frequencies as our bliss binaural beat, which imploded him into that array. And remember, just before he left to teleport, every time he's clear, he sees where he was through his left eye and where he's going through his right eye. And that is the implosion in the pineal, which is teleporting you into that array. So it's a very specific and measurable physics that's setting up that teleport, which is this implosive conjugation. And then there's this little section about John Dee's discovery of the alphabet of the Enochian was actually this hypercube physics, which basically is at the center where the pine cones kiss, is where the imploding cube becomes pentodeca, the turning inside out point, and the 32-degree tilt. And so this is actually a climax of the John Dee work then, in which became this map. And we're not going to do all of these.
It's funny. So yesterday, when I'm starting to map out the relationship of the piezo beam that the obelisk is doing, it took me right back to the cube physics. Yeah. In fact, an inner core cube is going to be incorporated into the design of the next one.
That's right.
I'll talk to you more about that off camera.
And when you set up lasers to phase conjugate, your cube has to be accurate to angstrom level. Absolutely. And that's what gives you the phase discipline. And so the cube superposed in dodeca, then it's ratcheted by golden ratio. And here is the sequence of geometries you see at the moment of death, Heinrich Clouvet form constants, which is also lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, which is how the DNA is recursively braided to implode during the phonon coherence called human bliss, which lines you up for lucid dreaming and surviving death. And here are the university studies measuring the harmonics which cause lucid dreaming, which now we know almost fit my equation, also fed to Therify.net, and that plasma triggers lucid dreaming, embedding in the array, very analogous to remote viewing. Other practical examples, Agnihotra. So here, if you line that up with the nodes of the array, you create this massive fertility effect. But you do this precisely at sunrise and sunset, so much so that your hair stands up on the millisecond. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, I was just going to say that when I lived in Hawaii, I studied the ancient monuments that were there. Hawaii has the largest step pyramid in the state of Hawaii, and it's oriented towards the sunrise on the solstice. And it has another one miles away, the second largest one, second or third largest one on the island, and it's oriented towards the sunset on solstice.
And and
Um,
it reminds me of Ron Holt talking about the Minhunis in Hawaii.
so they were the ancients were very aware of this.
Yes,
So
exactly.
and then so when you dig into the culture, so they were doing human sacrifice on sunset, and they were doing
Mhm.
probably fertility rituals at sunrise.
That's right.
So they were engineering consciousness.
And
At,
we know the physics why you can measure um, rainbows when Tibetan saints die because collectively they add a centripetal force to the grid, actually, which is the physics of the reason rainbows exist. So rainbows measurably show up when great Tibetan saints die, or Aboriginals for that saint. It's plasma physics. And here is the physics of Stargate, the trapezium and Orion, the most expensive Stargate in our galaxy, which was the Orion Wars. And the angle of that Stargate Pleiades Orion Sirius 60-degree light cone. And I think we're going to finish the slideshow shortly, but just to say, when you do that figure eight to implode in the infinity walk, which you can measure curing dyslexia within weeks, and you feel the corpus callosum get hotter when you do that infinity walk. It's a figure eight cross crawl walk to your favorite music, and you're turning your head. And so everything is forcing cross hemispheric blood flow at such high pressure. The reason the corpus callosum gets hot, and you can feel it, that implosion, and the physics of why that cures dyslexia. It's
hmm.
actually the left right sorting, sharpening perception where the pine cones kiss. And there's too many slides here. We just, that
Well,
consciousness is the collapse of the wave function. And that's the context here, that if you want to be conscious in the array, we're collapsing that wave function at the node of the array.
so one more quick little thing. I want to show it in as it's moving. So I have this video that we made in virtual reality
Oh, thank you. I love
that
these.
shows
So
there's collapse. Those are the waves collapsing down the nodal points
the
that you're talking
implosion.
about. Albeit this nodal structure is not to scale of your star mother. It's the shape, but not the right distances. But that's really what the wave collapse looks like, going down a whirlpool, following those nodal points. There you go. You have the actual one. And this
Vortex.
is just I just slapped this together in virtual reality, and so we can make it and look at it.
It's gorgeous.
Dan, tell the story. I'm gonna tell the story to everybody watching is that
Oh,
you
yeah.
and I had done shows and talked about this, and you showed me these physics so much that I got you a VR headset and then got you into virtual reality and then built this, which is a star mother or hydrogen molecule, and brought you in there in person and said, Dan, now point and show me where charge collapse happens.
Yeah,
Where does it happen? What's going on? Because I ran it through my mind so much. I said, now, where is the charge?
that's right.
And there's the points. And so charge electrons follow that route, and only the ones that are collapsing by increments of the golden mean can form this perfect whirlpool. Like we know, we already know about whirlpools, we know about hurricanes, the black holes are sucking up matter from the galaxy, and we have the same shape
And how the
over and over
vortex
again.
makes gravity. Yes,
And this is it, and your pine cone. But this demonstration is only on this plane, but it's really coming in at all ways from all different waves from different
that's
sources of charge, and it's happening
such
in the 3D
wonderful work.
environment in real time. And so it explains kind of what we're looking at, what we're talking about here.
I'm
Your
so grateful
pictures
you
do
took.
it a lot of justice, but they're not in a three-dimensional concept. So I think a lot of people just don't get it. But
Yep,
it's a whirlpool that goes all the way to the Planck. And then
exactly,
these transverse waves, because they can only fit through an aperture at the Planck
exactly,
distance, they get squirted into a longitudinal wave.
exactly. That's right. And then they can go superluminal, and they can embed in the array. That's exactly what we're saying. It's so fabulous that Tony built that in 3D. I am eternally grateful to you, Tony. That was
I never understood it. You can understand when you're talking and showing us these things, it's obviously it has merit, right? So you show us things that have merit. Well, everything you're saying has merit, but I never could understand it until I could see it in a 3D
that's so
situation.
beautiful.
Like
And you,
cellular division in school, they had it in the book, the cellular division. I had no clue. And when I
yeah,
finally saw a movie of it, I went, oh, that's how it works. And then it all made biology made sense.
Yeah,
And
and
so
we know
having,
we can prove that's exactly the way hydrogen's built for sure. We have the equations, and then we can prove that's the way DNA is built for sure. And then we can prove that's the way the stack of platonics called electron shells and nuclear hadrons is literally only a platonic nest. So we can prove that's how the atomic table is built precisely because the platonic nest is the golden ratio dodec. So everything we have that becomes self-organizing called origin of negentropy uses that physics called Planckfire.com. And that is the central model. And that's the hydrogen in the water that absorbs Tony's longitudinal wave as well.
um, well, that's beautiful. And like I said, like putting it in relation, and once I got it, once I understood how that works and everything you were talking about, then the harmonic scale, the cascade
Mhm.
that you have on your website really made sense. And I started to apply it to binaurals, what I'm doing elsewhere. That it's like once you get into that, it's really makes a lot of sense, and I've been having tremendous results. Can I do a shameless product plug?
But please, please, now's the time.
So I'm putting together, it's under construction, but in order to have it faceless, I don't want Tony Rodrigues selling something. These obelisks and the directions on how to use them for healing and for meditation and for remote viewing will be available, and as well as binaural and meditations that I've made. I've made tracks, and it's psion.com. So PSIION.com is
Is
going to
that
be the
two eyes?
two eyes. Yep. PSIION, Scion. All the other cool ones were taken, and I just wanted something that's kind of faceless that I can advertise it on its own, and it's its own animal, because people look at the space program or what I've been through in my testimony, my other books, and some people are attracted to it, but some people are turned off by it. And I wanted a neutral vehicle to share this technology because it works so well. It
The
works very.
obelisk. Yes, which is good.
There.
And
Shameless product promotion.
oh, beautiful.
Number
It's powerful. It's useful. And these are seeds for remote viewing in many things and healing. And Tony is making them piezo after our discussions, etc. And that then a parallel shameless product plug here, then, if I may, however, firecrystal.com, PHIRE crystal.com, ultimately triggered by piezofire.com, options there, but you can trigger it with your breath the same way Tony did. These things are so powerful that everyone so far who's picked one up, immediately demands they want one. And so we haven't even been able to list them for sale yet because we can't get them fast enough. But
I haven't touched it. I want one. I have some crystals back there, a lot of Vogel shaped crystals and crystals. There's a real effect. There's a real piezo effect and a piezo, I
and the
guess,
idea is that
storage.
parallel sides you can conjugate more accurately, and they are incredibly powerful. Even although the vocal ones are nice, but these are, we think, off the charts.
Uh-oh.
And oh,
The other thing is well, I don't even want to talk about it, but there's mechanical stresses that you can put on it as well to
yes,
create an effect. So
that's right. Which
mechanical
is
stress on a
and
crystal.
and a mechanical would an example if you put piezofire.com, the little wafer under it, vibrating at exactly the cascade, and then that is very effective. And then of course we have ultraviolet going. So there's so many things that can be the phase conjugate pump wave, and that's what actually makes the obelisk work, what makes the pyramid work. When that same Schumann phase conjugate pump wave hits the pyramid, it pumps out the longitudinal coherence, which is pyramidwirelesspower.com. It's all explained. So we have carried on. What did we miss?
Okay, yeah, we could. Because you know what, talking about ultraviolet, I always want to talk about near infrared and how that could a near infrared pulse
Uh-huh.
into the mix of that would be very beneficial as well by
Yeah.
oxygenating the cells
Yes.
of the viewer.
It reminds me of when uh, my friend Phil Callahan proved that the reason in the biodynamic Steiner School classroom that you test the kids if they've visualized the rows they just drew accurately enough when they close their eyes. The test is if the room fills with the smell of roses. And he explained the physics that the flowering brain actually makes the physics of infrared. And I have seen hummingbirds smash into the window with the young people having bliss because they smell the bliss in the sealed house because the infrared, which is the physics of olfaction, goes through the window.
Wow. So yeah, and that's what I said, and that's the difference, like I said about those arrays, is that they can embed properties, the electrical properties of chemical into
Yeah,
the water, not the chemical properties.
that's
So
right.
that's and when you ingest it, you're getting the electrical shape of the information of whatever they're trying to embed. So
Yep.
medicine can be carried electrically.
The frequency, and we should credit Sal Giandinoto here for the experiments when he conveyed the effect of vitamin C into water with frequencies only. That's just the beginning of this. And there's a whole bunch of psychotronics on this. It's all
That's
fun.
us. That's what we're doing. So, and you know what's funny is I also look at this as like ways to explain it for people. Like I said, obviously we're moving fast here, but I hope we explained it for people watching this in a way that they can get. And because moving forward, mankind after a post-disclosure world or whatever's happening, like we're moving fast as a whole, as a species technologically, and people need
Right.
to understand this is the basics for
Right.
all of the for everything to come
Right.
and
It's
what we're
and
made
when
out of.
when we change the harmonics of our power distribution in our grid to be Schumann, the transformers will start to become self-aware. And at that point, if we haven't learned physicsofsoul.com, we're in trouble, actually. We're so when our AI becomes so powerful, until we learn the physics of what a soul is, which we now know is the compression that enables the aura to radiate coherently in the longitudinal array, Keshan body, rainbow light body. These physics of soul is the access to this compression bliss effect that allows your aura to radiate coherently in precisely this longitudinal effect, which enables not just remote viewing, lucid dreaming, and taking memory through death, which is obviously the physics of soul.com, that form of coherence. So until we can teach our young people, our universities, and our schools the physics of what a soul is, they're going to continue to destroy the souls of billions of kids with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and electrosmog and crap and the wrong nutrition. So we
So yeah, you
must
have to bring your head up. You have to poke your head up out of the
exactly.
ocean, the electric ocean that we have. You have to poke your head up
Yep.
or down for that matter, because caves are also a refuge. But I'm a big champion of Faraday fabric, and I'm in fact have a project. I want to Faraday my entire bedroom
Well,
and where
I
I'm
think
sleeping.
the phase conjugate pump wave will go through a Faraday cage fine, but actually, the real place where you get the Schumann, which is the DNA radio, is not in a Faraday cage. It's a place where isolation is not perfected. No, it's a place where embedding is perfected, and that's even trickier because that means
And that's
you need a
a
sacred.
nodal point.
Yeah, you need a stone circle in a forest would work good.
Yeah, a good nodal point. Yeah. So
That's
fortunately for me, I live in Sedona, and there's a lot of big nodal point
nice,
structure obvious, and so
nice.
it's early for that. But we're experimenting with finding a nodal point and doing remote viewing on site and how that would work.
And,
Um,
and
so I'll let you know. It's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing research that
where
we're
we
going to
did
do.
the first major Ophanian calls, Red Rocks in Sedona, and we called storms the size of continents. Absolutely. And this is the kind of rainmaking that's required for California now. Hello, goldenmean.info/rain. To be continued. Well,
Okay, so we can wrap here. So
thank
thanks,
you,
Dan,
Tony.
for this, and thanks for sharing everything with everybody. And stay tuned. I think we both have a lot of work to do.
Tony, you're a hero. And I think the twinkle in your eyes is pretty cool also, actually. I'm grateful to work with you, man. More
Yeah.
fun to come. Blessings, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks, guys. See you soon. Bye-bye.